I will just want to present you our first speaker, Dr. Nigel Holmes, who has an extensive experience in low-carbon energy generation, supply and use. He has been a member of the Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association since 2005, and he's been chief executive since April 2011. Over the past 10 years, the association membership has grown significantly and now includes over 160 members from industry, city and local authorities, universities and colleges, and development agencies. Nigel's presentation will be on scaling up hydrogen across Scotland. Welcome, Nigel. We're very happy to have you presenting at our webinar. The stage is yours. We'll just share your presentation.
And good morning, and thank you very much for including me in the program. So the slides I'm going to present are going to take us through some of the activities happening in Scotland. So next slide, please. And it's very much about how the activities in Scotland are being shaped by some of the policy ambitions. So the key policy ambition is the target for being net zero by 2045. So the Scottish Government's target, which was set in May 2019. And as part of that, there's been a whole series of additional work carried out. And this culminated not last year, actually in December 2020, with the publication of the Scottish Hydrogen Policy Statement, with the very ambitious target for 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030 in Scotland. And the presentation is very much about some of the work that has started already and some of the foundations that have been put in place with projects across Scotland, projects about production of hydrogen, but also the demand for hydrogen, and how that all needs to come together if we're going to deliver not just the 2030 targets, but net zero. Next slide, please. So back to the start, this really kicked off in May 2019 with the publication of the report by the UK Committee on Climate Change, advising the UK and the Scottish governments that they needed to start to set net zero targets. And the advice for Scotland was for 2045, and for the UK as a whole was 2050. And the Scottish government accepted that, put that in place very quickly afterwards, and since then has been working towards that ambition of net zero by 2045. And there's also a series of interim targets. They're on the chart here, just on the left, starting, well, there was a 2020 target, which was for 56% greenhouse gas reduction. Didn't quite hit it. I think it's 52%, but still a massive reduction from the 1990 levels. But the next targets are going to be even more taxing. The 2030 target for a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is one of the most ambitious I know of. But it's also critical because to achieve the net zero target, we have to deliver the interim targets as well. Next slide, please. So the key thing is that this is not just an ambition without foundation. That there is actually a lot of progress has been made already, particularly in the decarbonisation of electricity in Scotland. So the chart here, the graph shows the increase in renewable electricity in Scotland over the past 15, almost 20 years. And by 2020, Scotland was producing almost 100% of its annual electricity demand from renewables. And the bulk of that renewables generation capacity and the energy production is coming from onshore wind. So about 60% of onshore wind, about 10–11% of offshore. But going forward, we're going to see a change in that balance. Next slide, please. And this is going to be linked to the massive production of wind offshore as well as onshore. And again, in the hydrogen policy statement, it talks about the ambition for the 5 gigawatts of low carbon of hydrogen by 2030, linked to the target for the offshore wind by 2030, which was the 11 gigawatts of offshore wind. Since then, so last year in September, there's an additional target coming in, which is for up to 12 gigawatts, between 8 and 12 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity in Scotland by 2030. So onshore wind and offshore wind. And together, that creates a massive opportunity. Next slide, please. So what we have to remember, of course, is that hydrogen, apart from a very, very few unique occurrences, it's not there in nature as like a gas field to recover and to use. You have to make it from energy, and typically it's made from the conversion of fossil fuels into hydrogen, or use of renewable energy as renewable electricity or biogas into hydrogen, giving rise to the terms blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. But the big growth potential for Scotland is the green hydrogen from renewables, and in particular green hydrogen from offshore wind. And here you see some of the activities that are already in place and are moving towards the delivery of that 11 gigawatts by 2030 target, which is being supported by the deep wind cluster. And we'll come back later on to talk about some of the other activities, in particular around the ScotWind and where that's taking us. Next slide, please. So that's the context. Yeah, we have the target for net zero. We have the interim targets for 2030, etc. So that's where we need to go. The question then is, what part can hydrogen play in delivering these targets, in terms of both the production of clean energy supplies, and also helping to start displacing fossil fuels. So all very well making the clean energy, but you need to find practical ways of displacing the use of fossil fuels in transport and in heat. So this is where some of the key learning is coming from early projects that are happening around Scotland. I'm just going to take 4 examples of what's happening. There are now many more, but just 4 examples to illustrate this. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start in Methil in Fife. This was actually one of the early locations for hydrogen project development in Scotland. Not the earliest, but one of the early ones. And what you see in the picture here is the location of the hydrogen office, which is just on the dockside in Methil. And this is where some of the early projects happened. So you've got the wind turbine, you've got solar panels, and around there's actually a number of buildings that were used as a test for some of the smart grid and the local production of green hydrogen and the use of hydrogen, for example, for displacing grid electricity. Next slide, please. But one of the other key activities that's been ongoing for many years in Methil has been outreach and education. And the hydrogen office, the team in the hydrogen office were very active in going out to doing workshops with local schools, with local colleges. And they estimate that since 2011, they've reached out to about 30,000 pupils and students in Fife region. Fantastic, setting the groundwork for basically an appreciation of how hydrogen can make a contribution towards the decarbonisation of the energy system. And I'll come back to that, but that is actually critical in some of the next steps in Methil. Next slide, please. And back in 2017, one of the successes at the Hydrogen Office was the Leave and Mouth Smart Energy System, supported by the Scottish Government's Local Energy Challenge Fund. This was about using energy from the wind turbine, from solar panels, producing hydrogen, being able to store that hydrogen in the hydrogen tanks. Seem to have lost the slides there, but I'm sure they'll come back. The hydrogen tanks provide you that buffer capacity. There's a fuel cell, so you could re-electrify that into the supply into the microgrid. So essentially private wire, so that it could run off the wind turbine solar when available, and then the fuel cell when that wasn't the option. And also using the hydrogen for transport. So there was a fleet of vehicles. There was 2 refuse trucks running on hydrogen diesel, dual fuel, also transit vans, and Renault Kangoo fuel cell range extended electric vans. So very much a system approach, local energy system approach. But Methil is next going to be the hub for a really important trial. Next slide, please, which is about starting to use renewably produced hydrogen. In this case, it's actually produced from an offshore wind turbine. So you can, on the picture on the left, here you can see at the top left of the picture, the tiny wind turbine on the dock side. That's the one next to the hydrogen office. And on the right, a very much larger wind turbine. That's a 7 megawatts. It's actually a development Samsung turbine that was installed a few years ago, now being operated by the offshore renewable energy catapult. And that will be providing electricity to an electrolyzer that's being installed, storage tanks, and the hydrogen supply will go into a network, a new network of gas pipes supplying the houses that you actually see in the picture, bottom left of the picture. They'll be running additional gas network pipes along the streets, number of streets in Methil, and the householders will have the option of choosing whether they stick with the existing natural gas for heating and cooking in their houses, or they go to the use of 100% green hydrogen. So this is a real test, not just of the technology in terms of the production, distribution, and the use of the hydrogen in heating and cooking, but also a big test of, will the consumer be willing to make a change from natural gas to hydrogen, and in this case 100% green hydrogen. So this is the SGN H100 trial, currently being installed, should be operational next year, and then starting to produce some of this evidence. And the evidence will be critical in terms of, can this same approach then be rolled out on a much wider scale, not just on a few hundred houses, but thousands, or maybe very quickly moving up to city scale. And that will then be an important source of demand for hydrogen, and that will then again be key in the business case for actually starting to scale up hydrogen production across Scotland. Next slide, please. So hopefully in a couple of years' time, I'll be again sort of talking through the stages of progress and activity, and this slide will be very much about using the offshore wind for green hydrogen production, and using that for decarbonising households, typical households, a mixture of shared use properties, semi-detached, detached properties, flats, a big range of houses actually being considered for this trial in Methil, an important key trial, not just for Scotland, but for the UK. Next slide, please. So, and in terms of the question that's just popped up, who pays for replacing the new boilers and cookers? Well, that is all covered as part of the trial. So the attraction is that the resident doesn't have to pay for the hardware. The hardware is being supplied as part of the trial. So 300 households part of this trial in Methil. So moving up the east coast to Aberdeen. Aberdeen, traditionally known as the oil and gas capital of Europe, now the energy capital, and they're doing a lot to decarbonise the energy system. Next slide, please. The big success over the past few years in Aberdeen has been to build up the transport fleet. This picture was taken in 2019 when they had about 60 plus vehicles, single decker buses, refuse collection vans, smaller vans, Renault Kangoos, cars, Toyota Mirai, the Hyundai, and using the locally produced hydrogen to decarbonise the fleet and to reduce emissions, improve air quality. Next slide, please. And this is built up, and this is the refueler down at Kitty Brewster. The initial refueler, which was supported by the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking, has been one of the most reliable refuelers in Europe. Very high availability, which is key because at the start that was the only refueler in Aberdeen. and supplying the bus fleet. So this was the core refueling station for the bus fleet, one of the bus depots. In fact, the service depot is just at the back of this, the refueler of the building just next to it. Next slide, please. And the project with the buses has built up. They've now brought in a fleet of new double-decker buses, so gone from the single-deckers to double-deckers. These are actually the right buses from Northern Ireland. I think there's now 25 of these in operation, regular operation. So, for example, the route going out to the west of Aberdeen, Colts, Peter Coulter, that is, if you travel on that route, the chances are it will be a hydrogen bus that you'll be using. And the feedback's been very positive, nice and quiet and comfortable. People prefer them to the diesel buses. And the price of the buses are coming down. The price of the hydrogen fuel, that needs a bit more work to get that to be truly cost competitive, but going in the right direction. Next slide, please. And recent announcement, late 21, was about the Aberdeen Hydrogen Hub. So that is really now starting to look to scale up. And BP, as a long-term employer in Aberdeen, picked 2 locations worldwide for this approach. One was Aberdeen, the other was Houston. Next slide, please. And also in Aberdeen, there's a lot of work going on around developing the green hydrogen test and demonstration facilities. This is part of the energy transition zone, so it's taking skills from the oil and gas sector and seeing how these can be used for the green hydrogen and renewables approach. So this is a project still underway. And if it's something of interest, please do get in touch with the Energy Transition Zone. They are looking to shape the activities at the moment in terms of what this will be doing. Next slide, please. And I've mentioned the renewables in terms of the source of hydrogen. There is also blue hydrogen being considered. So just north of Aberdeen, St Fergus, is a project, the Acorn Hydrogen Project, the Acorn CCS project. You need both. You need hydrogen production, and you also need the carbon capture and storage if you're going to use natural gas for blue hydrogen production. So this is currently underway. It's on the UK government's reserve list in terms of projects to support. And potentially this could give us one of the ways of quickly scaling up the level of hydrogen production. So starting to get infrastructure, supply, and the corresponding demand in place. Next slide, please. So also very much looking at the hydrogen hub approach is Cromarty. Some fantastic work going on there. This is very much about building up local industry demand for green hydrogen and also the production and potentially the import and export of green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So the activities in the Port of Cromarty Firth, it's starting to move from an area which used to make oil rigs to a support base for offshore wind supplies. So what you see here in the Firth is a floating offshore wind turbine. There's going to be a lot more of that coming through, and also around the area there's plenty of space for facilities such as green hydrogen production, other activities linked, and just up the coast in Invergordon, for example, there is the distillery, and not just one distillery, several distilleries, very interested in the use of hydrogen to actually decarbonize their processes. So it's not just governments that have targets for net zero. There's also a number of industry sectors which are starting to set the targets. So the whisky sector is one, the water utilities is another. Next slide, please. And the work at Port of Cromarty Firth also recognises that you need to have early supply of hydrogen to scale things up. Just realise I've just been told my battery is going low. Is it my battery or is it the other screen? My apologies. So import export of green hydrogen for Port of Cromarty Firth, and that could be key in an early scale up. Next slide, please. And here is just a snapshot of the activities going on around the area. So again, this comes back to the key message. if you're going to start scaling up production, you need to scale up the demand and the infrastructure to fit with that. So the hydrogen economy doesn't just happen by scaling up production. You need everything to happen to actually make it work. Next slide, please. And a good example of that is happening in Orkney. For the past 7 or 8 years, they've been developing hydrogen production, hydrogen demand as what is called either a hydrogen territory or a hydrogen valley, or in the current consultation with the draft hydrogen action plan, a hydrogen hub. Next slide, please. This was very much about starting to use some of the surplus renewables, renewable electricity, which was being constrained off the grid because the demand for electricity wasn't matching the supply, and using hydrogen to actually store some of that extra energy and move it around and use it in different applications. So the electrolyzers on Edy and then Chappensea, able to produce and supply green hydrogen into Kirkwall. Next slide, please. Where the hydrogen can be used for a variety of applications. Some of it is being used in the blue box on the left. That contains a fuel cell that can provide power to the ships when they're in harbour. The vans are hydrogen fuel cell range extended vans. But there's a lot more also starting to happen in Orkney. Next slide, please. And building on projects like Surf and Turf and Big Hit, there's been further projects around feasibility studies for decarbonising the Orkney distillery, conversion of ferry auxiliary power to hydrogen, a project to actually produce the first hydrogen fuel cell hydrogen ferry, the High Seas 3 project, and further project around decarbonisation of aviation. Next slide, please. So some of this is involving test flights of single engine planes, but going towards twin engine planes, such as the Britain Islander. Project Fresson is looking to have flight trials this year, and this was the same type of plane as it used on Orkney for some of the inter-island flights. Next slide, please. And the Kirkwall Airport is one of the areas that is seen as a sustainable aviation test hub. On the tarmac is actually a Britain Islander. It's not a fuel cell hydrogen version yet, but hopefully not too long before that actually happens. And the airport also has a project to have hydrogen genset producing electricity for the airport, allowing the airport to have heat and power from a very sustainable supply of green hydrogen produced locally in Orkney. Next slide, please. But where does it go next? And this is where we really start to look at scaling up. So next slide, please. Several projects are being developed across Scotland. One of these is the Flotter Hydrogen Hub. And the proposal here is using up to 2 gigawatts of offshore wind from one of the ScotWind lease sites to produce green hydrogen production. This could be an operation by the late 2020s. And the key thing here is Flotter is an existing facility. It's used for oil storage. So it's very much around starting to use some of the existing oil and gas assets for conversion to very large scale use of renewables for green hydrogen production, and then potentially that green hydrogen production for conversion into other products. Could be methanol, it could be ammonia, or it could be exported as hydrogen into adjacent markets. Next slide, please. But it's not just the Flotter Hydrogen Hub. You'll probably hear a bit later about the Orion project, so I'm not going to say much more about this, apart from similar approach, taking existing oil and gas assets and starting to see how these can be converted into future assets for sustainable energy production, storage, distribution, export. Next slide, please. And the opportunity was really underlined on Monday of this week when ScotWind made its announcement about the successful bidders. 17 projects have been successful, a total of 25 gigawatts of proposed offshore wind capacity. So compare that to what I was talking about at the start with the 11 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, massive increased potential. And if you actually look at the amount of seabed that is actually taken up by that 25 gigawatts, you can start to see how there is actually so much more potential around Scotland for additional offshore wind. So, the opportunity for Scotland is about becoming one of the major hubs of green energy production, but then not just decarbonising Scotland with the 2045 target, but starting to build up the potential for export of green energy in the same way as Scotland's exported oil and gas, becoming a major exporter of clean energy. Next slide, please. And this fits into the need for clean energy, not just in Scotland and the UK, but around Europe. So potentially very well located for that basis. There are clearly other countries looking to supply into Europe, Spain and Portugal with solar, Africa with solar, but the the closeness of Scotland into some of these markets could be a key advantage. So that's a very quick canter through what's going on. Next slide, please. Just to wrap up, this is all looking very promising, but we have to remember that we still need to make sure that we build on the experience as we scale up. We can't go from 0 to hero in just one step. It's a very staged process. We need to have all of the people working on this, and if we do this right, we will deliver net zero, but we'll also deliver some massive benefits to Scotland, economic, employment, and many others as well. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that gives you a good starter for 10, and I'll join you in the panel discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you for the excellent presentation and setting the scene for what is happening in Scotland in terms of net zero ambitions and how do they tie with the green hydrogen ambitions we have, and finishing how this can all feed into the European hydrogen market. Thank you for providing us with all those interesting examples across Scotland and alluding to both the presentations that are to come in your examples. We'll see you at the panel session.